including where next for the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs, and the role that mobile might play post-2015. And for that discussion, I want to introduce to the stage here Lord Malloch Brown, who is the Regional Chairman of FTI Consulting and a former UN Deputy Secretary General. Sir. And if you'll start by just taking us through your sense of where mobile connectivity and development is and where it's going, and then perhaps we'll talk a little after that.
Becky, thank you, and let's certainly make time to talk. If we can keep you all from your lunch at all, I think we better make this as interactive as possible. Just a couple of little stories to start with. In 1999, I was the new head of the UN Development Programme, and a great chum of mine had just been elected president of Nigeria. And we sat down first in New York and then in Abuja to sort of talk about his development priorities. And what he wanted me to fund as UNDP was rural electrification, which was kind of way beyond our budgetary means. What I wanted to fund was improvements in institutional good governance in the country. But what both of us saw, me particularly coming to see him in Nigeria, was that there was something that neither of us could fund, but if he could get the framework right, might transform his country. And that was when I got to see him in Abuja. I'd driven in via Lagos from Benin, the country next door. And the moment I crossed the border, I lost my cell signal. It's actually a bit like having an O2 account here in this room today. And it was striking. While 10% of Africans in 1999 had cell phones, none of them were in Nigeria. Today, Nigeria is the fastest growing cell phone market in the world. In the first quarter of next year, 80% of all Africans will have cell phones. There are already 820 million subscribers now. But if, for example, you're Vodafone or MTN and you look at the astonishing transformation of cell phones in Nigeria, MTN has 42 million customers. It is an extraordinary revolution from literally scratch over little more than 10 years. The other story I just wanted to tell to set this was a year later, now completely seized by the power of communications as modern communications as a development transformer. I went to a conference in San Francisco and gave a speech about how I felt ICT, as we then called it, information communications technologies, could transform Africa and indeed other developing regions. The speaker after me then got up and completely rubbished me, said it was all about drugs and textbooks and schools, and that this was, I'd been put up to this by commercial interests. His name was Bill Gates. And actually, while Chris and others who you've heard from this morning have long since understood the power of this, Bill himself has remained a magnificent skeptic and until recently, much more in Dean's camp, that technologies are useful, but only when they're enablers of a whole wider set of transformations. Technologies don't bring the drugs, they don't bring the teacher. They can enable things that do connect you to those. But I think it's an important point to understand. And so, I did just in this opening want to frame the debate that has sort of underlain a lot of what we've heard this morning, which is, does the cell phone and technologies more broader make development or enable development. And, I mean, the New York Times had a magazine story quite recently, "Can the cell phone help end global poverty?" And went on to basically assert it could. And, we've heard of examples like M-Pesa this morning, which really, is an extraordinary thing, reaching 70% of Kenya's adult population, various estimates of how much Kenyan GDP passes through it, but probably something like 25%. But just take M-Pesa for a moment as not a maker of development, but an enabler for people to get across deep underlying dysfunctionalities in the Kenyan political economy, of which the first is that the reason people in part use it so much is one of the dramas of so much of modern Africa is that you live away from your family. Men have to migrate to seek for work. Women often also have to migrate for access to markets or whatever. So it is a tool for overcoming split, separated families, moving money between them. It also represents until recently with the rise of banks like EcoBank, it represents the fact that the banking sector across all of Africa and South Asia for that matter was skewed towards banking services for the very rich, not banking for the poor. So again, it has covered this. And indeed, more broadly, many of these applications are substituting for the lack of services to reach the poor. So while it's an extraordinarily powerful enabler, it is no substitute for getting those basic building blocks of development in place. It's not a choice of bricks or clicks. It's a matter of how do you combine both in a way that enables healthcare, etc., to be delivered. And just a couple of quotes from one of another dean, if I can put it that way, someone else who's made many similar points, Kentaro Toyama, who says that it's a lot easier to buy 100,000 PCs rather than to provide the complex set of inputs to educate 100,000 kids. It's a lot easier to set up a text messaging system, a health hotline, than actually to persuade mothers not to feed kids dirty drinking water. And I think the examples go on. And so, what I really wanted to in opening, just conclude by saying is, time after time, development has gotten traduced or seduced by some technology silver bullet. Whether it was roads or vast hospitals, you name it, there have been so many kind of, if you like, white elephants of failed development strategies in Africa, which have been hugely costly and in other regions as well. Where things work is where it comes together as a total solution, where the technology is the enabler of those more down-to-earth, basic bricks and mortars strategies. And I think, that theme has underlain a lot of what we've heard today.
So then, Mark, where do you see the greatest potential for solutions in development going forward? I mean, you've talked about M-Pesa. A lot of what our audience will have known about in the past was M-Finance, probably plus M-Health. Does this audience concentrate on M-Finance, or is there a wider spectrum than that? Where is that greatest sort of potential?
Well, I think it's a matter of sort of opportunistic innovation. Where can we extend this technology in a way which is really useful? And I'm on the board of the Shell Foundation, and it's worked with M-Pesa on something called M-Copa, which is all about, being able to get energy to rural areas, build via the cell phone. Well, that's, really starting to meet a need that was not there before. And, again, thinking about this, another example but makes the point is, the World Bank had a massive, typical sort of expensive project in Ghana, $50 million, I think it was, $50 million, to create a land registry, because in Ghana, one of the big problems is land ownership rights. At the end of the success of the project was at the end of this, there was indeed a land registry. The failure of the project was not a single land title had been registered. Along comes a guy with an app and an iPad. And he realized that the reason no registration had taken place was it still took several months and cost thousands of dollars, so beyond the reach of the farmers who needed to register their land in order to get access to credit and to improve their, enhance the investment in their farm. And so he, with his iPad app, was able to take photos of the land, map it out via the app, and reduce with the use of this new land registry from thousands of dollars and weeks to hours and I think hundreds of dollars. And so there are examples of where it has become the enabler of overcoming this problem. And if you look for one such problem, I mean, we sort of think of India, but Africa has this as much, of the home to a massive middle-tier bureaucracy which through the so-called license Raj has made almost everything inaccessible, unaffordable, and corrupt in terms of access for poor people. IT overcomes a lot of that. So, I'm again in the category where there are smart innovators who see particular problems. It can help the farmer get to that extra half mile he or she needs to really transform their business. And it's why, in terms of the Millennium Development Goals, I do believe that coming into a new generation of them, a goal about global access to communications is going to be a critical objective for successful development.
And do you expect that to happen? An MDG for connectivity post 2015?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sensibly going to combine physical connectivity with media connectivity. It goes to what I and others have said this morning. It's great to get market prices, but you need the road to take your food to market. And so, I don't think we should isolate out IT from that broader issue of the full panoply of communications, physical and soft, if I can put it that way, which link citizens to the global economy and the opportunity it provides, however isolated and marginal and their lives and location has been till now.
Just thinking about how multinationals operate in developing markets, which in the past we've seen sort of operation models as seen as philanthropic sort of slash CSR. Does that work, or should a multinational's model be commercial, or should there be a combination of the two? How should things work so that things are transparent, I guess, is the question.
Well, look, I mean, I think there are several strands to the answer of that. One, there are models of innovation which are not all about bottom line profit. I mean, the whole rise of social entrepreneurship as a model of social creation of social good is a critically important one to nurture and enhance. But secondly, there is a hugely important commercial role. We had GlaxoSmithKline up here this morning. I mean, the role they have played completely IT apart in transforming the affordability and availability of relevant drugs to poor people's diseases is a remarkable one. The third thing is that in part they have done that through partnerships with foundations and enlightened governments. I mean, just as DFID was an investor in Vodafone's M-Pesa, so the Gates Foundation has been a critical partner with a lot of big drug companies in key R&D and key affordable distribution schemes to get these drugs out. So it's not anymore, a simple sort of public versus private or profit versus non-profit model. It's partnerships that combine the interests of the different partners around a common goal, which works for markets, works for foundations. So if you like, as I say, works for both business and not-for-profit models.
Have you in the past, when you've and you have such an experience of development in the developing world, have you seen the problem of companies not investing enough resources in sustainable models, so that things start coming back to this sort of aid and pilots type environments that we've had in the past, which just simply went nowhere? If you've seen it, what's your advice?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a huge problem, and it has several roots to it. I mean, for a long time, emerging markets were, for many multinationals, a bit of a hobby. That has gone. I mean, now everybody recognizes that the real growth opportunity going forward, whatever their business, is almost certainly going to be emerging markets. So there is a much more sort of greater seriousness of long-term investment in these markets, but it is still subject to the whims and of, if you like, the movement of global capital. And, as someone who, thought that the foreign direct investment in poorer parts of the world was an inevitability in 2007, I heard the great sucking sound of 2008 and 9 as a financial crisis in the developed world sucked capital back from the periphery. So you've always got that problem, but I think, as I say, I think it lessens over time as the long-term interest of these markets is recognized and grows. But you do still, Becky, you're right, have, in a sense, another hobbyism here, which is, too much sort of top-down innovation of the kind of, gosh, this surely is going to work for poor people. And then a frustration when poor people don't use the technology in the way anticipated, or the assistance in way anticipated, and where the project has fallen at the first fence of successful development, which is listening to the beneficiary and reflecting that in the design. So, there remain an unacceptably high level of false starts, if I can put it like that, in development activities.
Questions from the audience? One here, please, yes. And one of them. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Julian Marcel. I am an academic at Wits University in Johannesburg, and I actually had the distinction of serving on a UN ICT task force with Kofi Annan, so I'm familiar with some of the work that Lord Malloch Brown has done. What I wanted to ask, and then ask for a comment about, is that we've been talking now for about maybe 3 hours. And one of the things that occurs to me is that perhaps the organizers, and particularly Lord Malloch Brown, would like to comment on the fact that we've been talking about innovation in mobile technology as though the site of that innovation remains in London and San Francisco. And one of the points that he made, which I think bears reinforcing, is that only when we regard innovation performers as coming from the developing world as well, will we actually make the inflection point. And so regarding this as either a hobby of multinational corporations is probably not going to take us over the inflection point. And if we were talking about inexpensive cars, we would be talking about Tata. If we were talking about reductions in the cost economies of medical treatments, we'd also be talking about some innovators that have come from the developing world. So perhaps we also need to, before we finish today, be reflecting on what sort of barriers exist, even in terms of our mindset for thinking about the innovations as also originating from and needing to be supported from the developing world.
Very good point. Mark?
Yeah, no, look, here, I'm glad you've said it, because if I've given the impression that I think the innovation comes from London or San Francisco, then I and other speakers have not done the subject justice. I mean, there's been some very interesting writing about how in Kenya, there's an extraordinary amount of innovation going on off the back of M-Pesa, where local innovators are creating technologies which have a potential global market. And having myself spoken at various sort of venture capital conferences in South Africa, organized around the theme of African innovations in this area, I know the extraordinary sort of, if you like, global social laboratory there. And to just indulge myself with a slightly broader point, the way I look at it is I compare a business school education in the US to a business school education in South Africa. And I think there is an IT combination, because if you go to the US business school, while it's changing dramatically, I know, it's still a lot of traditional stuff about finance, etc. If you go to any one of the great new business schools of South Africa, you might be confused for a moment and think that you are doing social work studies, because the need to care for, protect the health of your employees, invest in the human development of that employee workforce, of those in your supply chain, etc., create an entirely different, more social business model dynamic. And so to take that point to IT, I do not think that sitting in London or the States, you can possibly meet that test of listening to what the beneficiary wants. You are going to miss it. You're just not going to optimize the kind of people-centered design that social media and cell phone related technologies need if they're to be as successful as they potentially can be.
The problem is, though, that we know that Kenya and its social incubation sort of arc, as it were, is the exception that proves the rule, that that's just not being encouraged enough elsewhere. So I think the idea of what we do about reducing the barriers to entry, starting with mindset, is an important one. What else can be done on the physical barriers, though?
Well, look, I mean, in the case of Kenya, frankly, it was government reforms which are only as old as 2008, which really allowed this thing to move. In the case of Nigeria, as I mentioned, it was a reform and liberalization of the cell phone licensing market of 2001, I think it was. So, and much more broadly, the institutional arrangements, the rule of law, which, allows the innovation and copywriting in a sensible framework of invention. All these things are, absolutely critical. And so, I think it's not, as you rightly say, Becky, it's much more than just removing the barriers in the mind. It's creating the enabling framework of laws and institutions which protects and encourages and nurtures this kind of inventive innovation.
Questions? Yes, just here at the front.
Thank you very much. Patricia Hewitt, Senior Independent Director of BT, but also Chair of the UK-India Business Council. Picking up on that last point, Mark, about good governance as the absolute foundation for achievement of the Millennium Development Goals and much else besides, I was very glad you referred to India's extraordinary move forward on the unique personal identifier, which also confirms the point a colleague just made about, India is way ahead of this country, for instance, on electronic personal identifiers and indeed electronic voting. And I think that's a very interesting example of the government of India, which was being criticized this morning, and it's criticism everyone regularly makes for very slow decision-making, corruption and the rest of it, has reached out to India's astonishing private sector leadership to create that electronic identification program specifically to tackle corruption and improve governance. And I just wondered whether you had examples from other parts of the new world, if you like, or the renewed world, of similar mobilization, both of private sector expertise and of technology, to achieve those governance reforms that are so critical for everything else.
Well, in a sense, Patricia, the one that is most striking is the way that cell phones have increased honesty in elections. Because for a long time, the business of electoral observation was a handful of foreign observers, going in and going to a handful of voting booths on election day to check whether things were honest or not. And it was a bit of a hit or miss affair. I, in earlier stage of my life for my sins, used to be an advisor to elections all over the world, so I know how hit or miss it was. And now you have seen over the last decade these dramatic citizen-driven cell phone-based movements where local vote counters call into their party headquarters the numbers from that polling station, absolutely reducing the potential for electoral fraud. That's just the beginning of something that's now gotten a lot more complex as it spins out. So I think it's key. But I would just say that, we were talking about the MDGs earlier, and I've said there should be an MDG for communication. But I equally, while it's a very difficult and controversial area, believe there has to be an MDG for good governance, because, they need each other. It's not just that good governance allows communication, it is so much the root of, in a sense, every one of the different other aspects of successful development as well. And I think it is worth reflecting before we all get caught up in the euphoria of all the great things that are happening and the great success we're having in reducing poverty globally, that over the next 20 years, during the lifetime of this new generation of Millennium Development Goals, the locus of poverty will shift from the majority being poor people in big countries like India to being poor people in failed or failing states, because the Indias and Chinas are steadily eating into their poverty by the rates of growth. And so the fact that we are going to have the majority of the marginalized in the world in countries which don't enjoy democracy, don't enjoy effective institutions, don't enjoy the rule of law, gives us pause for thought that even in a conference like this about the media, the cell phone and media, we need to remember that critical backbone of democratic institutions and rule of law, we've got to make sure we go on pressing the case for that as well.
Can I take one more question from the floor? Yes, just here. Sarah, we'll come to you at the beginning of the afternoon session. I know that you're keen to make a point. Yes, keep it short.
Sure. Ken Banks from QAngela.net. Thinking about platforms, if we can call them that, like M-Pesa and Ushahidi and Twitter and so on, and seeing the kind of activity and innovation happening in developing countries around those platforms, and given the rise of graduates from computer science universities and degrees in developing countries, should we stop in the West trying to build solutions to the problems in the developing world and actually focus more on giving the right platforms and help develop platforms that allow local actors to actually solve the problems themselves?
Well, I think that's a good question to end on, because it's a very critical, central question, and it has an easy answer: yes. Because I think, as we've all been saying, I mean, we in our different ways, and maybe hadn't said enough, as the lady from WITS said earlier, is that in a sense, if those platforms will be subject to dramatic local adaptation, or at least apps and everything else being put on them, which do address local needs in smart, tactical, applied, highly relevant ways, and in a manner that, sitting here in London, we're going to kind of miss the goal if we try and do it from here.
And on that, we will take a break for lunch. It's an excellent session, some food for thought, as it were, over the lunchtime period. This afternoon is about scalability, about providing sustainable solutions for partnerships going forward, as we look at what is today's summit on mobile for good. Enjoy your lunch, and I'd ask you to be back here so that we can get a full session in this afternoon at 2 p.m. So it's 45 minutes from now. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.